Quilting terms. Having trouble with some of the most popular quilting terms. Some of the terminology for quilting that you will find useful are outlined in this video. Accent quilting can add a pattern that works with, but follows, different lines to those of any patchwork. Achromatic color schemes, using black, white, and gray only. Album quilts, these use a mix of blocks pertinent to the maker, the recipient, or an event, and are usually gifts for specific events or circumstances. Amish quilts, these are very simplistic and orderly and always functional. Analogous color schemes, neighboring colors on a color wheel. Anchor fabric, this is used when piecing to hold the fabric pieces together when machine piecing. Applique, not specific to quilting, but often used on quilts, this is the use of smaller pieces of fabric, often making a figure or character, stitched to the face fabric of the quilt. Sunbonnet sews are examples of these. Various stitches can be used visible or invisible. Backing fabric, as you would expect. This is the base fabric. Bargello quilting, use of fabric strips to give the look of a wave. Basting is a way of holding the three sandwich layers together temporarily. You can tack, pin, or use sticky spray. Batting is the middle or wadding layer of your quilt sandwich. Bearding is when the batting fibers come away and find their way through to the face or base fabric. It happens more with polyester wadding. Beeswax coating on the thread makes it stronger and prevents it from knotting. Betweens are quilting needles, and they are very short. Sizes 9, 10, or 12 are generally used, the 12 being longer than the 9. Binding is used to create the quilt edges. It is essential to cut the binding on the bias to avoid pulling out of shape. Blanket stitch, originally used to edge blankets and prevent fraying, it is also used as a decorative stitch for securing pieces of applique. Block, a section of patchwork, usually, but not always, square. Border, fabric strips used between blocks and or on the top, bottom, and sides. Cat's ears, a block style also known as prairie points. Chain sewing, a continual thread to sew pieces together without finishing off and restarting. Chain stitch is an embroidery stitch that resembles a chain. Charm quilts have only one shape, which is used repeatedly but never using the same fabric more than once. Cheater's cloth, a fabric which looks like it is made of patchwork, but which is actually printed. Cool colors, blues or greens. Crazy quilt, quilt using irregular fabric pieces stitched to foundation fabric and then decorated. Crosshatch, parallel lines marked on the quilt to help hand stitching. Crosshatching uses straight lines on a grid, diamonds or squares or rectangles can be used. Dimensional applique, this stands in relief from the quilt cover, either stuffed or not. Echo quilting, lines of quilting that repeat around the edge of a piece of design. Fat quarter is a yard and a half of fabric cut in half to enable a square piece 18 inches by 22 inches. Foundation blocks are blocks that are made up of any number of small pieces of fabric. The finished block is then joined to other finished blocks to create the patchwork face. Try and keep the fabric, if possible, to have the straight grain on the edge of the block. Frames can be small circular hoops for hand sewing or large rectangular frames for holding bigger quilts. Friendship quilt, made to be given to friends or family and often having messages or using swap fabric. Grain, the line of fiber running perpendicular to the side selvage. Hawaiian applique, a technique for applying very detailed design pieces onto quilt fabric. Hoops, large frames to hold the quilt for hand or machine stitching. Lap quilting, quilting squares as complete pieces, and then joining the pieces when they are all made. Lattice strips, strips bordering the blocks. Loft, the spare between face and the backing fabrics, high lofts mean warmer, thicker quilts. Meandering or stippling style, this is a style of filling in areas of the quilt with stitch, but none of the stitching should touch, so you can't cross over a line you have already stitched. Marking, marking the quilt by tracing or freehand to indicate where to stitch the quilt. Tailor's chalk or wax is often used, soap also works. Medallion quilt, a quilt with a central design from which the rest of the design follows outwards. Millennium quilts, or Y2K quilts, to commemorate the year 2000. Miters, a method of measuring diagonals and angles. Monochromatic, all one color. Motif stitching gives a pattern that can be done on plain or patchwork quilting. Motifs allow the quilter to incorporate names, hearts, animals, flowers, in fact, any object, or an abstract pattern. Muslin, a very thin plain fabric, often used as a foundation fabric for piecing blocks. No knots are to be seen when quilting. The trick is to pull the knot through to the batting layer so that it can be hidden. When you finish, you will also need to lose your knot in the center batting. As with a starter knot, wrap the cotton a couple of times around the needle, check your last stitch hole, pop the needle back in, and pull it through so that the knot stops in the batting, then cut the thread close to the fabric. Offhand, usually, the left hand which guides the needle from underneath the quilt. Outline stitching is, as you would expect, intended to provide an outline, and achieved by stitching about 1/4 away from the seam. By doing this, the quilt is strengthened, as you get, in effect, a double line of stitching, and the other advantage is that the stitching is inside the cut edge and no seal allowance is needed. Paper piecing, using paper to attach pieces in a block. The paper is usually numbered or lettered and the pieces are matched, stitched to the paper and the adjoining pieces. Piecing, stitching pieces of fabric together, or called patchwork. Quilting thread is a single strand of very strong cotton and glaze to help it pass through the batting. Rocking, this is the popular method. If you rock the needle back and forth, you should be able to get about 4 or 5 stitches on at one go. Sampler, showing several different quilting techniques. Sashing, fabric strips that separate blocks. Satin stick, side-by-side stitching. Selvage, the edges of the fabric where the weave was finished. Seminole quilting, creating large pieces of fabric with pieces so that the joined fabric can then be cut and used with shapes repeated. Sewing in the ditch refers to stitching very close to a seam where the stitches are barely visible. Sharps, fine needles for joining pieces and stitching on applique. Stencil, using a pre-made shape for transferring designs and motifs. Template, a shape for cutting pieces, made of plastic, paper, sandpaper. Warm colors, orange, reds, yellows, and tans. Thank you for watching another Unstoppable Intellect video. Don't forget to like and subscribe to help keep the channel growing. Knowledge is power. Together, we'll make you truly unstoppable.